Donc, dernière table ronde de cette journée dédiée aux relations entre Picasso et Boccioni, un artiste qui a expérimenté la peinture mais aussi la sculpture, qui se présentait d'ailleurs comme peintre-sculpteur, et un artiste qui est actuellement, dont l'œuvre est actuellement mise à l'honneur dans le cadre d'une exposition rétrospective organisée par le Palazzo Real de Milan. Et donc pour discuter de ces relations entre et des convergences existantes entre l'œuvre de ces deux artistes, nous accueillons Rosalind McKever et Elena Versari. Alors Rosalind McKever, vous êtes docteur en histoire de l'art, senior fellow du Metropolitan Museum of Art de New York, spécialiste de l'art moderne italien, et vous préparez justement un ouvrage dédié à l'œuvre de Boccioni. Nous vous écoutons.
Merci beaucoup. I will try and be quick, just to thank the organisers and scholars who have given such rich papers, and also to thank all of those involved in the New York and Paris exhibitions. Their increased precision in Picasso's sculptural chronology and emphasis on the dissemination and reproduction of his sculptures during his lifetime and beyond really struck a chord with my current work in progress on the Italian futurist Umberto Boccioni, which has perhaps similar aims, if for an artist with very different circumstances. Boccioni made 13 plaster and mixed media sculptures, but following his untimely death in August of 1916, only 4 have survived. 8 of those lost are known through photographs, giving intriguing glimpses into his process and making clear the importance of mixed media in his first sculptures. As I will outline very briefly today and has been addressed in depth by Chris Poggi and Elena Versari, Boccioni was using manufactured multiple objects in his sculptures in combination with modelled elements. Pivoting from multiple objects within sculptures to sculptures as multiple objects, I also wish to look briefly at the bronze editions. Despite the aforementioned destruction, Boccioni is perhaps best known as a sculptor due to the multitude of posthumous casts in art museums worldwide. For Picasso, on the other hand, it seems that his sculptural output seems to require regular reintroduction to the public since 1966. And so I will briefly, I promise, look at a couple of moments when the casting and dissemination of Boccioni's bronzes correlates with that of Picasso's. Given both artists' interest in the use of mass-produced objects as their subject or material for their sculptures, and their own and others' replication of their work, I hope that reintroducing the sculptures through this means will promote an interesting dialogue which shows that objects of experimentation, a phrase that Boccioni used in 1914 pejoratively about Picasso, actually works for both artists. The interaction between Boccioni and Picasso in the sculptural realm begins at this pivot point between bronze and mixed media. The narrative of this foray into sculpture for Boccioni has often been framed in terms of Picasso, particularly as a response to his first Cubist sculpture, Head of a Woman for Ronde, of autumn 1909, which now, if from going on from here, if I just say for Ronde, for speed, this is what I mean. Boccioni is thought to have seen a bronze of this in Vollard's gallery in spring 1912 when he was in town for the futurist Bernheim-Jeune exhibition. On March 15th, indeed, he wrote to Vico Bauer, "These days I am obsessed with sculpture." Boccioni returned to Paris in June, and it's likely on this occasion that he toured the sculpture studios of Archipenko, Aguero, Brancusi, and Duchamp-Villon. In July, he returned to Milan and wrote the Manifesto of Futurist Sculpture, backdating it to the 11th of April 1912, and then he began to sculpt. This chronology somewhat slows down the idea that Picasso's Fernand caused Boccioni, to use John Richardson's words, abandon painting for sculpture. It seems a slightly slower process. Supposed formal similarities, sorry, I'll show you anti-graceful. Supposed formal similarities between Picasso's sculpture and Boccioni's anti-graceful, which I show you here, have supported this narrative. Other things that support this are the fact this is the only Boccioni work that he painted with this sort of bronze colour patina. It's also the only surviving bust by Boccioni, and as has been sometimes thought and potentially first perpetuated by Roberto Longhi in 1914, for a while this was thought to be Boccioni's first sculpture. While the chronology of Boccioni's sculptural works continues to be fraught, many have argued, I think successfully, that this was not Boccioni's first sculpture. Indeed, Laura Mattioli has dated it to April-May of 1913, so a year after Boccioni supposedly saw Fernand. Instead, this fusion of a head and a window was likely Boccioni's first, made in August-September 1912. The work closely follows the ideals of the Futurist Sculpture Manifesto. In this text, Boccioni argues for the use of numerous heterogeneous materials, listing glass, wood, cardboard, iron, cement, hair, leather, cloth, mirrors, electric lights, and so on. In Fusion of a Head and a Window, Boccioni uses many of these. There is a real window and pane of glass, which you may not be able to quite make. Yeah, you can just see the lines there of the glass, I hope. It's also a knot of real hair, a glass eye, and as you can see from this image on the side, a wire facial profile. The dating of this work has been based on a letter that Boccioni sent to Severini when he describes himself as battling with sculpture. He continues, and I must say these are Boccioni's words and not mine, "The cubists are wrong, Picasso is wrong." However, at this stage, it's doubtful that Boccioni would have seen any mixed media sculpture by Picasso, so we shouldn't assume that he is referring to that. Nor indeed is it likely that he would have seen the paper sculptures being produced by Braque. He was in Impasse Gelma in June of 1912 when Braque was there too, but the, I believe, slightly disputed chronology of when Braque was producing those means that we cannot be sure that he saw anything. This is relevant to the marked difference in Picasso on Boccioni's use of objects in this period. As Poggi has discussed, Severini's collage and Boccioni's sculpture was far more literal than that of Picasso and Braque. Most of the mixed media elements in Fusion of a Head and a Window function as themselves. However, the glass eye functions as one presumes as a real eye, and the wire profile is certainly not literal. It is worth noting that when Picasso reflected upon Fernand, he said that he had first thought about using wire, but considered this too literal and too much like painting. The literalness of manufactured collage elements was an important discourse within Futurism in these years. In February 1914, the Florentine writer Giovanni Papini, editor of the little magazine La Cerba, which is relevant as you can see the header in the collage here, published an article called "The Circle is Closing." Papini lambasts the artistic tendency that he summarizes as the way in which the lyrical and rational transformation of things is being replaced by the things themselves. Boccioni responded that in Futurism, the object became part of the work of art through their inclusion within it, but Papini was adamant that Picasso was far less literal in this area. However, a couple of months later, Picasso was producing his 6 glasses of absinthe with their, some might say, literal spoons, although I realize that not everyone is in agreement about the literalness of those spoons, but for my argument here, I am calling them literal. The sculpture of the glass of absinthe is an interesting moment of change and exchange between Boccioni and Picasso. It closely relates to Boccioni's sculptures of bottles, which I will show you here. And this motif from Boccioni is being plucked from this portrait of Kahnweiler, and this is the Boccioni drawing, which is thought to be taken from it. Boccioni first exhibited his, I'll show you development of a bottle in space through form here. he first exhibited this, the other version, which Louisa referred to earlier, the red version, and Form Forces of a Bottle at Galerie Le Boétie in June-July of 1913. Picasso was away for the opening, but he, as was alluded to earlier, attended the Conférence Contradictoire on June 27th, 1913, where he would have been there to see the aforementioned literal collages by Boccioni. And this was a few months after, it's worth noting, the Picasso's assemblage, where he's using a real guitar and a real bottle. This work by Boccioni is potentially his first purely plaster sculpture, so he's abandoning the relationship between the real and the modelled, which Picasso found so interesting in the glass of absinthe. This, I would argue, and this is to flag it, my pivot point, as it were, the relationship is amplified by the casting of these works in bronze, as the actual absinthe glass, and I'm referring to the glass, not the Picasso work, and the spoon, like the actual artworks by Picasso, would have been produced using a mould. The same can be said of wine bottles, as is often betrayed by the seams that you find down the side. So this point transfers to the Boccioni. Boccioni potentially, and this is still an area that we're working on, made those two identical bottles from one clay work. So he was casting in plaster from clay. So again, there's this process of the production of moulds and the creation of plasters. To cut a very, very long story as short as physically possible, a plaster was used to produce bronzes of the Boccioni bottle, which again brings us to this issue of multiplicity within these objects. And as Louisa explained, while Picasso's glasses have maintained their limited edition through their painting, this was not the case for the Boccioni bottles. Ooh, sorry, I skipped that, but I think you all know it, so it's fine. The casting of Boccioni bronzes was instigated by Marinetti in 1913, and as we well know, by this date there were numerous Picasso bronzes, which Marinetti may have seen in Paris, and he may have been familiar with the glass of absinthe through Caeda and Christian Zervos. However, there's no evidence really that this was what Marinetti had in mind when he was producing the three casts, the two of unique forms and one of the bottle that today are found in MoMA and Musée del Novecento in Milan. Indeed, it's been argued that Marinetti was fulfilling Boccioni's own intentions with the style of these, but that was argued by Benedetta Marinetti when she was trying to sell them to Bar. Notably, however, you will see that the development of a bottle in space, you may be able to tell it's not that normal a bronze colour. It was plated in white metal, perhaps to try and evoke the original white surface of the plaster. MoMA acquired their two bronzes after 8 years after their first Picasso bronze, and in Bar's negotiations, they agreed that she would produce two more. And these are two of the ones currently now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The relevance, as I hope is painfully obvious, is there were huge changes to the appearance at this stage, partly because of the addition of the base, which is present on the original plaster, and a rougher surface, although I would say from looking at them, this is much truer of unique forms than of the bottle. And this is you can see the comparison here between the plaster, which is not entirely smooth, but the very rough marks that we find on the Met cast. Versari has wonderfully found a document in the Lydia Winston-Malvin archives that suggests that Zervos could have been involved in the decision behind this, and that he was thinking of Picasso's recent bronzes, and this is Zervos's involvement with them has been touched on many times previously. I would like to, as briefly as possible, support this suggestion with a redating of the Metropolitan's casts, in that they are normally described as being of 1949, which comes from Benedetta historically. However, this would discourage a relationship between Benedetta and Zervos, because it was really from 1950 that they were collaborating. They worked on an exhibition at the Kunsthaus Zurich, and of course there was Zervos' 1950 special edition of Cahiers d'Art on Italian art. There we go. On the pages of Cahiers d'Art, it is the Comune di Milano bronzes which are reproduced, and so my argument is that it was at that point when their friendship began that the Met bronzes had not yet been produced. This is supported by an invoice from the foundry, wonderfully, and also correspondence with Paolo Marinotti, who is not a Marinetti. And but this also suggests that Paolo Marinotti was one of the people encouraging her to produce bronzes more faithful to the original, and so this slightly dilutes this question of Zervos' involvement. I am going to skip the final part about the American collecting, but if you have questions about that, you can ask me later. Are you sure? Okay. You sure? Okay, I'm going. Just finally, I would like to highlight that, as I said earlier, the MoMA were buying their Boccioni bronzes a few years after. The next moment where there's a real correspondence between them seems to be 1956, when MoMA acquired 3 Picasso bronzes, and that is the exact same moment that Lydia Winston Malbin and her husband were buying the Boccioni bronzes, which are now in the Metropolitan, and correspondence in the Getty archive shows that also Peggy Guggenheim and Sidney Janis were interested in the works at the time. So while it's not the same collectors that are interested in the bronzes, it is certainly American collectors, and you could argue that the dissemination of multiples by each artist supported the popularity of multiples by the other. And so to conclude, the more precise chronologies for Boccioni and Picasso allow a more complex relationship to emerge, highlighting how the sculptures as objects and the objects within them were objects of experimentation well beyond the 1910s. Thank you very much.
Merci Rosalind pour cette présentation dont nous allons parler peut-être après celle d'Elena Versari. Elena Versari, vous êtes historienne de l'art et enseignante à la Carnegie Mellon University. Vous avez publié 2 monographies, dont l'une sur Brancusi en 2005, une autre sur Kandinsky en 2007, et vous avez publié de nombreux essais dédiés au futurisme, au cubisme, à la sculpture moderne et de manière générale aux avant-gardes internationales. Nous vous écoutons. Merci.
We're still not sure about what compelled Boccioni to write the Manifesto Futurist Sculpture following the succès, the scandale of the exhibition of futurist painting held in Paris in February 1912. More than the direct influence of a specific artist or another, I am inclined to believe that the conception and subsequent launch of the manifesto was Boccioni's and Marinetti's tactical response to the climate of expectations surrounding modern sculpture created by critics and the press, such as the note that you find here, published by André Salmon in January 1912. 1 year later, as we can see from this note by André Varnaud, Boccioni's Manifesto Futurist Sculpture had radically altered the expectations surrounding modern sculpture. This, in spite of the fact that its author had yet to exhibit any actual works derived from his theories. The manifesto had also catalyzed the activity of many other artists working in Paris at that time. In the manifesto, Boccioni called for the use of different materials and even hypothesized the insertion of a motor or a mechanical device to impart movement to sculpture. Some time after the manifesto's publication, Archipenko starts, possibly, working on the first version of Medrano, the first movable sculptural assemblage. And Picasso, we know, is busy with a newfound interest in papier-collé and creates his guitar made of paper strings and wire. One of the most difficult but more interesting challenges for the study of modern sculpture in these years is keeping track of the game of anticipations and delayed or even indirect and misguided influences. It's an analysis that takes in consideration the distance between theorization and realization, between words and works, and the fact that each of the two might produce very different results. Right at the beginning of 1912, 4 days after André Salmon announced Picasso's imminent involvement, or better, re-involvement with sculpture, Volat sold the second bronze cast from Head of a Woman, the clay work that he had acquired. Maybe it was the sale of the bronze that spurred Picasso to return to sculpture. Surely, Head of a Woman allowed Boccioni to visualize the three-dimensional materialization of some of Picasso's early formal exercises in painting, something that Boccioni undoubtedly used later that year when, after publishing the manifesto, he decided to transfer the subject of so many of his own paintings into sculpture. And Fernando, however, had a stronger impact on Boccioni's first hands-on experiments with sculpture than on his theorization of the innovations necessary for this medium. And when Boccioni tried to create sculptures that engaged more overtly with the innovations heralded in his manifesto and less with his own painting, he had to leave Picasso's sculptural example behind for a while, at least. In the manifesto, Boccioni had called for the use of a plurality of materials, such as transparent planes, celluloid, glass, sheets of metal, wires, external or internal electrical lights. He had theorized the use of color to increase the emotional force of the planes, and he rejected the idea of the statue as an isolated idol that, and I quote, carves itself out of and delineates itself against the atmospheric background, unquote. He said, let's open up the figure and enclose the environment within it instead. Several of the works that he created between the fall of 1912 and the spring of 1913, and he exhibited in Paris in June 1913, exploited the material quality of plaster to achieve these goals. Plaster allowed for the insertion of objects such as a window, wig, glass, eye, a railing, as well as other materials in the sculptural mass. It allowed itself to be colored, to be inscribed over with words, and even through the process of casting to offer an alternative view of the same work, colored, stippled and textured, or left white. Significantly, the creation of plaster sculptures also allowed Boccioni to reflect anew on the relationship between perception and form, an issue that had progressively distanced him from Cubism, and it's through sculpture that he becomes more critical of Picasso's analytical style. Working three-dimensionally, Picasso struggled with the question of the gaze and how to transform the interaction between object and background from a two-dimensional to a three-dimensional construction. This is evident, for instance, in Antigrazioso, and also Head plus House plus Light. In this work, a single mass is presented to infer the idea of the head and the house as a continuum. Boccioni tried to solve in this way the problem posited by his desire, voiced in the manifesto, to fuse the object and its environment. Soon, however, in Fusion of a Head of a Window, we find a deviation from this route that is metaphorical but also literal. If we look at the sculpture from one side, we can see that Boccioni inserted into it a device that calls for a conceptual alternative to the single frontal viewpoint. He reconstructed the profile of the woman with one single metal wire, thus exploiting the traditional procedure of constructing a plaster sculpture with armature. The wire sizzled in thin air, has no real structural function, and is almost invisible from frontal view. Its role is simply metaphorical. It suggests the idea of a head's profile without evoking any realistic visual impression of it. The simple wire marks an important shift in Boccioni's attitude towards sculpture and vision. While the introduction published in a catalogue of his 1913 sculpture exhibition presents multi-materiality and linear dynamism as two coexisting, equally valid procedures, and he couldn't do otherwise lest he repudiate his manifesto of the year before. The manuscript version of the text shows that Boccioni had arrived at the second solution after struggling with the first, and I quote, "I thought that by decomposing this material unity into several materials, we could have already obtained a dynamic element, but through the process of working, I realized that the problem of dynamism in sculpture is not contained in the diversity of materials, but primarily in the interpretation of form. We have, therefore, a more abstracted sculpture in which the spectator constructs in his mind the forms that the sculpture suggests." End quote. And probably referring to his own experiments with the wire outline, in the manuscript still, Boccioni wrote, and I quote, "The sculptural ensemble becomes a volumetric space by offering the sense of depth from any profile, and not several fixed, immobile profiles in silhouette," end quote. The solution of the wire, a transitional step toward the conceptualization of the linear dynamism of unique forms, was still felt by Boccioni as a problematic solution because of its intellectualism. It was too near Picasso's greatest limitation, according to Boccioni, that is, and I quote, "the scientific analysis that dissects and studies life as corpses," end quote. Again, in his archive, in a folder devoted to sculpture, we find the doubling of a portrait in frontal and side views, maybe the first idea for the wild profile, right under a scratched out note on cubism that reads, "The cubists create an unreal environment." Boccioni here is trying to create a sculpture that's not limited to frontal gaze, but he's also trying to steer away from the plurality of successive views theorized at the time and celebrated by critics as a conceptual key to cubism. In Boccioni's book, published the following year, but heavily rewritten in 1913, we read, and I quote, "We are not concerned only about the object given in its integrality through Picasso's higher level analysis, as I have called it. Rather, we also want to convey the simultaneous form that derives from the intense interaction developing between the object and its environment," end of quote. It's interesting to note that even Picasso might have recognized Boccioni's wire profile as something more congenial to his own work and to the drawing in space that he codified later with Gonzalez. Many years later, talking about Head of a Woman with Roland Penrose, he said, and I quote, "I thought that the curves you see on the surface should continue in the interior. I had the idea of doing them in wire, but it was too intellectual, too much like painting," end quote. So Boccioni and Picasso's paths diverged when the Italian abandoned the use of several materials in order to conceptualize unique forms of continuity through space. But a year later, the Spanish artist offered an unexpected solution exactly to the problems raised by Boccioni's first engagement with polychromy and material. Picasso's thin sculptures and the bronze series of the glass of absinthe of the following year further his own research in collage aesthetics, but also distilled some of Boccioni's innovations into new formal and material choices. Compared with Boccioni's dynamic still life development of a balanced space, Picasso's glass avoids the challenge of plastically conflating three objects, bottle, glass, and plate, by focusing on a single glass. The glass, however, is stopped by a real spoon, which is a tautological procedure theorized by Boccioni and used in some of Boccioni's early sculpture. Picasso also embraces, Picasso also embraces the futurist obsession with color and appropriates and applies to tin and bronze some of Boccioni's experiments with stippled, textured, or color plaster surfaces. Indeed, Picasso's use of stippling in painting and sculpture surfaces right at this time. Finally, it is surprising to note, these are some of the examples of the surface as you see. The background of Antigrazioso was actually heavily textured and colored. Surprisingly, though, we see that the central opening of the glass, showing the level of the liquid contained in a solidified plane, calls, without citing it explicitly, Boccioni's merger of interior and exterior in the bottle, but maybe also, more strikingly, the upper neck of force forms of a bottle, a work that is now destroyed. However, it's not the colored and textured glass that caught Boccioni's attention. It's interesting to note that only after the publication of Picasso's construction in Les Soirées de Paris, and Boccioni subscribed to the journal immediately in December 13, Boccioni returns once again to a multi-material assembly with dynamism of a speeding horse plus houses, which was finished in 1915. In fact, it's not with the creation of the paper constructions, but with the publication of these photographs that Picasso publicly enters in the debate over plurimateriality and sculpture inaugurated by Boccioni's manifesto. And it would be interesting to consider the function played by Apollinaire in all this. Boccioni certainly saw in Picasso's construction an echo of his own idea, if not necessarily of his exhibited works. But he cautiously selected and reconfigured only a limited amount of details. In particular, he engaged with the protruding lower right section of the paper guitar, which in the photographs from Les Soirées extends visibly toward the viewer. The journal's illustration might also have spurred Boccioni's interest in the tabletop underneath the guitar, which, as Christine Poggia suggested, has no real supportive value but extends into the viewer's space. The spatial instability and lateral dynamic tension created by this absurd tabletop slanted leftward is further enhanced by the white angled paper element underneath it. Boccioni reconfigured the visual disruptions of the frontal perception created by construction with guitar into a ploy to suggest movement itself. His dynamism of a speeding horse plus houses, now heavily restored, was originally conceived so that the body of the horse in the foreground protruded outward from the vertical plane of the cardboard, mostly white houses in the back. The horse's head was positioned forward, suggesting the progressive detachment of the animal running away from the background. Two photographs in particular, this, taken in Marinetti's apartment in the 30s, have further complicated the issue, causing scholars to question whether Boccioni's horse should be considered a self-standing sculpture or a relief in the style of Picasso's. More research is needed to solve this issue, but in any case, whether Boccioni himself voiced the plan to hang the sculpture to the wall or whether this was Marinetti's idea to further enhance his friend's masterwork, dynamism of a speeding horse plus house eventually, at a certain point, was reconfigured and updated according to Picasso's published constructions. In conclusion, the relationship between Picasso's and Boccioni's sculpture, far from a simple set of direct influences, reveals a more complex game of anticipations and delayed responses. It's a cautious dialogue, held at a distance and is constantly redefined by public expectations and by the struggle to find a balance between radical innovation and artistic distinctiveness and maybe also coherence. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Elena et merci encore à toutes les deux pour vos interventions qui ont permis de mettre à plat ce jeu d'influence et de résonance possible entre la sculpture de Picasso et notamment la tête de femme de Fernande de 1909 sur les œuvres, les sculptures des cubistes et des futuristes qui travaillaient notamment et qui se trouvait à Paris au début des années 10. Mais vous avez aussi mis en lumière l'effet de ricochet possible, de résonance, des productions cubo-futuristes sur le propre travail de Picasso, comme si ces productions avaient pu agir comme un stimulant supplémentaire. Ce qui me frappe, et une idée qui a grandi tout au long de cette journée, où nous avons vu beaucoup d'images, beaucoup de photographies, et qui explicite peut-être encore davantage vos communications, puisque on sait bien sûr sur quoi repose toute la théorie du futurisme, donc notamment cette idée de la représentation du mouvement, ce dynamisme donc propre aux sculptures de Boccioni et que l'on retrouve finalement peut-être aussi chez Picasso et dans le verre d'absinthe, à la fois par ce travail de découpe ouvert de la sculpture, mais aussi le fait qu'il s'agisse d'une série de 6 verres avec lesquels peut-être Picasso a joué dans l'atelier avant de les confier à Kahnweiler, et où il y a presque une dimension scénique, théâtrale, je trouve, et peut-être scénographique de cet ensemble, qui, je trouve, renvoie un petit peu à l'esprit, à l'esthétique futuriste. Je ne sais pas si vous voulez répondre ou si je passe la parole au public. Louise, Malheur, il y a une question au fond. Attends. Wait.
I was saying there's very little time between Picasso receiving the bronzes to paint them and him sending them to Kahnweiler. They were finished on April 16th, and by the end of June we have to assume they are with Kahnweiler because he has photographs of all of them by July 3rd. And the scientists at MoMA who have studied the 6 casts have established that it took probably about 2 months for the oil paint to dry sufficiently so that they could be transported safely. Bronze is not a porous medium, and so it would have taken a little longer for the oil paint to dry. So while I like the idea of playing around it, and the glasses are sort of having a party, I'm not sure realistically how much, but he received the photographs and from Kahnweiler, and the photographs he received in Avignon in the summer were pretty much everything that Picasso had of his most recent production, because then they were stuck in Kahnweiler's gallery and lost to Picasso for a while. So that's just to add.
Merci Louise.
Oui, ce qui est intéressant aussi, je trouve, c'est que Boccioni a connu la sculpture de Picasso essentiellement par les reproductions, que ce soit la fonte de la tête de Fernande, la reproduction en bronze qui a permis une diffusion, on sait, une célébrité de cette sculpture, mais également par la reproduction par l'image, par les photographies, notamment, vous en avez parlé dans les soirées de Paris. Christine Poggi avait une question, je crois.
Merci. Thank you very much to both of you. I think the photographs were fascinating. I honestly have never seen that profile from the side view, so I'm really thrilled to see this very early example of drawing in space. It's quite remarkable. I have two comments which might kind of coalesce into one, and I'm just curious about your thoughts. One comment is that it's been said several times that the spoon in the absinthe glass is literal, but it's only literal if you think it's a spoon. But if you look at it from one side where the entire glass turns into a head, then it's a hat. And it's a very funny little hat with a little sugar cube turning into a kind of a box hat on an angle, and I think it's really there. So I think it's sometimes a spoon and sometimes it turns into something else. So the question of how literal Picasso is there, I think, should be maybe thought about in a more complex way. But that brings me to the Boccioni question, which is, even though he sometimes does use materials in a very literal way, the glass representing an actual window and so forth, in his manifesto, he talks more about almost the molecular properties of materials. He thinks they have different speeds and weights, and they're whirling around, and they will naturally collide and make differences in, create a kind of heterogeneous material environment, which isn't such a literal way of thinking. And then also in his debate with Papini, he seems to be already, of course that's later, but interested in the notion of transformation in art. So I think there are contradictions in Boccioni's attitude toward literalness and transformation, and I guess I just wonder how you both think about that, because his words, his actions, they seem to be evolving, but I'm not sure we can really attribute to him any one attitude because it seems constantly to be revised.
No, I would definitely agree, and I think there are some parts of the manifesto that resonate more with later work, some parts of the manifesto resonate more with the earlier, and trying to pick apart and trying to kind of attach too closely his words to his actions, I think in general in Futurism is a problem, but then specifically on this is really tough. And maybe you have more.
I actually worked on this on the translation when I worked on the translation of Boccioni's book, 1914 Futurist Painting Sculpture, into English, because I had to, well, I didn't have to, but I did look at the evolution of his ideas through the different manuscripts of the book. And it's very interesting to note the fact that Futurism is a movement, and as a movement has to structure itself with the necessity for a certain internal coherence. In particular, if you consider the importance of the publication of the manifestos one after the other. So in Boccioni, there is this constant evolution of his ideas. In particular, the problem of plurimateriality, the reference to the use of several materials, in my opinion, is a direct result of the particular moment in which he writes the manifesto. In the late spring, summer 1912, he is actually very much in touch with Marinetti. They travel Europe together, and Marinetti is also busy working, as you also have referred to, working on his own manifesto, technical manifesto of futurist literature, in which he celebrates the lyrical obsession of matter. And so there are definitely some, let's say, some translations of the manifesto of Marinetti right into the body of Boccioni's sculpture, such as the idea of putting stencil words on top of the sculpture itself. So you can find the word muro, which means wall, right, stenciled on the side of the sculpture, and so on. And these are things that come directly from Marinetti. Eventually, working with the problem of sculpture, I think that he, as I showed the document that I discovered that is unpublished, he eventually figures out that this is not something that can be kept. And clearly there is the polemical exchange with Papini, but there's also the dialogue that he establishes, and it becomes more and more important for him throughout 13 and 14 with the art critic Roberto Longhi. And Roberto Longhi is very much critical of the use of all these different materials. So that, well, some scholars have even suggested that Antigrazioso, for instance, if I can maybe go back here, Antigrazioso was created in two different versions, one of which lost, simply because the current state of the work is doesn't show the spears that you see coming out of the woman's head, which actually represent an element directly taken from a futurist theory in painting. I think that there's also the possibility of thinking about this later stage as an evolution of the work that Boccioni himself might have supervised, if you want. I found a note studying the cast in which Benedetta Marinetti clearly, it was something that concerned her directly, but Marinetta, she was saying that the current state of the plaster was the same, that it corresponded to the way in which the plaster was when the work was actually purchased by Marinetti. It might have been something that Boccioni decided to change himself. Clearly, the debate here is still open. It's not even, you know, it's a big, big question. So he's constantly evolving his ideas. Question? Oui?
Thank you. So thank you, Rosalind and Elena, for your presentation. And for Rosalind, I think that there are no doubts about the fact that Boccioni saw the Braque atelier in spring 1912 because he was in Severini's house and it was in the same place of that of Braque. So I think that it's pretty certain and sure.
The question is more about whether Braque had produced the paper sculptures, whether they would have been on display, whether he would have let anyone look at them. I think those
yes, but well, I think
in Pascalma is where it's happening. Yeah.
Yes, sure. And about polychromy in sculpture and the verre d'absinthe, I agree with Maria Elena with the idea that probably Picasso took inspiration by Boccioni's sculpture exhibited in Paris in 1913. And Boccioni's ideas also, but more than, for example, the Carousel Pierrot by Archipenko, because in the Carousel Pierrot, the color are linked to the orifice theories by Delaunay. More than, so there is a symbolic value also in the color. And in Picasso Verre d'Absinthe, I saw more an idea of different texture, represent different texture by the color, through the color. So thank you in any case.
I want to thank the two of you for very interesting talks and add a couple of observations and a question. When Laura Mattioli did her big Boccioni show at the Guggenheim, we were talking about Boccioni and Picasso, and she mentioned that she had found letters from Boccioni to Severini, or a letter saying, please send me, you know, whatever, go to Kahnweiler's, get me whatever photographs you can. I want to see what Picasso is up to. Another point that seems relevant here is that the reliefs published in Soirée de Paris in the fall of 1913 were done early in 1913. They are misdated in Pierre Dex's catalog. And it's very mysterious when they were photographed. They were not photographed by Kahnweiler because they were never sold to Kahnweiler. But let me just throw out as a possibility that since Boccioni and Picasso were in touch, that perhaps Boccioni got those copies of those photographs before publication directly from Picasso. This is just a speculation. On the question of the wire, Jean Crotti did a wire portrait of Marcel Duchamp sometime before 1914. I'm sorry, I've forgotten when it was. But it would be interesting to know whether Crotty was influenced by Boccioni or Boccioni by Crotty, what was going on there. And finally, picking up on Ilaria's comment just now, looking at the window, I was thinking about Delaunay's simultaneous windows, and whether, in effect, in the Delaunay, we are inside looking out through a window. Is it possible that there's some connection here, and that in the Boccioni we are outside looking in the window at his mother? But thank you again for great talks.
So I guess I take this.
Yeah, if you want.
So for the letters, I don't know if Caterina...
The question regarding the Kahnweiler photographs of the constructions, I thought Blair Hetzel had successfully proven that they were by Kahnweiler, made by Delatin. I mean, that's what her research told us, and they're also credited to Kahnweiler in Les Soirées de Paris. I've always asked myself, how come Kahnweiler photographs these works that never entered his inventory? But it's interesting that he uses Les Soirées de Paris, for example, to send to Cramache, and he tells Cramache these are studies for sculptures. They're not yet finished sculptures, because Cramache was so interested in Picasso's sculpture, and he's one of the first to receive photographs of the Ver d'Absinthe in July 1914, before Kahnweiler closes the gallery. And just to respond to Ileara, I used Archipenko more the review of Apollinaire and the excitement and the delight that he found in looking at Archipenko's colored polychromy sculptures, and that would have certainly made its way to Picasso. So I view it as more like perhaps Archipenko, Boccioni, and then Picasso in terms of a trajectory. Yeah.
Okay. Elena Versari, vous souhaitez peut-être répondre à Pepe Carmen avant
Oui, avant simplement français en anglais, maybe in English. It's okay. The letters, Severini, Boccioni Severini. I don't know if Caterina Zappia is here. I think that she will talk tomorrow. She actually published those letters first, so they are now generally considered to be letters that date from an earlier moment, at the end of 1911, and they are letters that were supposed to it was a letter in which Boccioni requests material in order to update his ideas of what was happening in Paris in order to prepare for the exhibition of painting. So it's not necessarily that. Boccioni is in Paris at the end of 1912, very, very briefly. But in order to do an analysis of what he saw, if it's possible, I actually did this around 10 years ago, and I worked mostly on what he could have seen in the production of Archipenko. One of the archival documents that is most useful is his carnet d'adresse. And it's also interesting because there are some missing addresses. So we probably, it's as an idea, but we probably know that Boccioni saw somebody in his own atelier or didn't see somebody in his own atelier. Especially, it's easy to do with Archipenko or Archipenko, according to the pronunciation that you want to select, and with Picasso, because these artists often change studios in these years. So generally, Boccioni, when he visits somebody in his own studio, he jots down the new address and he erases the previous one. So that is something that can be used. I used it, and I'm sure other scholars will. So yeah, the letters were published by Zappia. Letters to Picasso to get the photos. I don't know. I mean, it's an idea. I don't think the Picasso would actually send anything to Boccioni like that by mail. it's very unlikely that we wouldn't have any sort of proof of this, especially in Boccioni's own correspondence. Because Boccioni's correspondence, which has been published recently in a very, very good edition by Rovati, actually tells us a lot about even the fact that a lot of the letters that were arriving to the futurists were publicly commented by other futurists. So it's true that there was always competition, but material that would arrive to an artist would have been definitely would have been part of a conversation, even a private internos futurist conversation. In terms of Jean Crotty, that's very interesting. I don't know, maybe if you can give me a date of that solution. Clearly for Boccioni here is not just the 1915, so yeah, so it's quite later, but still, no, there is a tradition of profiles. I mean, it's not, it's clear though that here Boccioni is really working with the medium and with the, it's kind of a game, if you want, the idea of an invisible armature that is made visible, but at that point it doesn't support as an armature, it doesn't support anything anymore except just a frame of vision. And that is something that I think is important for his reflection, that at that time is really very much involved with the issue of frames of vision and the question of frontality. So I guess I responded to all of your questions.
Merci beaucoup. Alors je crois qu'il nous faut maintenant conclure cette journée. Vous remercier encore l'une et l'autre pour vos communications. C'est la fin de cette deuxième journée du colloque dédié à la sculpture de Picasso. Merci à tous pour votre présence. Il est déjà tard et nous vous retrouvons donc demain matin au musée Picasso à 9h. Ah, alors. Donc à partir de 8h30 au musée Picasso pour un accueil café.
8h50.
8h50 précise. Merci beaucoup, bonne soirée.